So in the second half of this chapter, we get into Spengler's theories of language, and this is his commentary on media studies, which as yet in 1920 was in process really of being invented by Walter Benjamin, I think, who was the really, not so much McLuhan, but Walter Benjamin is the pioneer in media studies. A lot of his writing is concerned with media and its how it works and its effects and what it is. If you read enough of his essays, you begin to see that what they amount to is essentially the birth of media studies. Spengler, of course, has not read Benjamin, but he begins this middle of this chapter by talking about, if you observe the hunter's relationship with his dog, you can see that even the dog understands language. The dog understands the way the hunter points, tells him where to go. The dog looks up, cocks his ears, responds, sniffs the air. If the master doesn't understand, then the dog barks to elucidate further clarity. You can see that there's a whole dialogue going on here. So language is obviously something that's present in the animal understanding. It's dispersed throughout the animal world. It's not at all unique to the human world. And Spengler says that the mistake that linguists have made up to this point is to identify language with verbal speech, with verbal language, and the two are actually completely separate. It is the human world that has invented the verbal, and we recall that he had made a distinction early in their chapter between expression language and communication language. Expression language in its highest form turns out to be the arts of form, architecture and painting and so forth, whereas communication language is the language of speech and writing. Expression language often expresses itself through the wearing of clothing, and expression language presupposes an I, but does not necessarily, it wants to produce an effect on a witness, but doesn't expect the witness to respond. And so we can consider the use of clothing in high society as a classic form of expression language, the desire to signify social status, to make an impression through wearing wigs and cuffs and laces and powder and so forth that the 18th century brought into such grand form. That's a high form of language as expression style, expression language, versus communication language, which expects a response, where it presupposes both an I and a thou and expects a response in return. So it's dialogic. Expression language tends to be monologic, but communication language is dialogic. Eventually, a fixed stock of speech forms is separated out. Spengler says that speech is eventually separated from speaking. Speaking belongs to the realm of time and destiny and race. It's the realm of the time, of the never recurring, the singularity. Connotations change. But with the separation of speaking, of speech from speaking, then we begin to get the need for schools in which individuals are schooled in correct speaking. Correct discourse that becomes reflective of a certain type of breed or a certain position in society. So we have this divorce and separation between them. But he says that even animals also have the difference between expression language and communication language. Birds obviously have a vocal language of communication, but the expression language, the stripes of a tiger, the stripes of a zebra, these are forms of expression language that are designed to make an effect, but not necessarily to elicit a response. So even animals have the same distinction between the two types of communication, the two types of language. But he says that with the human being, we have the invention of the word, the concept. And he says that he doesn't give a date for when he thinks this began, but he says that in its earliest primordial origin, language begins with the creation of the name. And he means name with a capital N here, as essentially the noumen. It is, he believes, it represents the birth of metaphysical thinking. Language came into being simultaneously with the birth of higher thought, metaphysical thinking, in which the human intellect senses a world. In animals, recall that he had said earlier that the animal senses and thinks at the same time. When the dog smells the air, he's thinking. He's trying to understand what's going on. So sensation and the understanding in the animal world are still basically identical. In the human world, they gradually become more and more divorced. And they first begin to become divorced with the fact that the human being senses, possibly hears or smells things which are not visible to the eye, and senses other presences, senses aspects to the world round that are not visible to the eye and which are therefore the cause of anxiety and world fear, and the world fear then is neutralized by the creation of the name, which neutralizes the world fear, creates the name as a sacred concept or idea, and begins the process of divorcing the understanding from sensation. He says this is the earliest phase of language. He says that the second phase of language has to do with the formation of grammar, in which, with the formation of grammar, the name begins to become a word in its relationship to other words in the formation of sentences. And we get the articulation here of speech. And he thinks that in origin, he believes that speech may have been, as certain forms of writing are later on, like for example amongst the Brahmins in India, a unique privilege, a privilege of an elite esoteric few who knew how to speak, and one possibly had to be initiated into this unique group of those who could speak. So then we have grammar coming in the second phase, and he says the verb would have followed somewhere thereafter. The verb is more abstract, he says, than the noun. The noun is a space word, the verb is a time word, but the verb involves, if we say that the stone is falling, the verb involves subtle differentiations that are not immediately present to the senses. They have to be inferred. For example, is the person running or is the person fleeing? The sensory input is the same, but the mind has to be able to infer what the nuances of it are. And so the verb is a more higher, more abstract something that's inferred, whether a stone is falling or whether it's tottering or how it's moving. These are all subtle differentiations, so the verb is more subtle than the noun. So he thinks it's a later invention. And then basically the final stage of language formation he believes to be the rise of syntax, in which grammar begins to break down and be replaced by syntax, and inflection begins to break down as well, and we begin to get a concern with word order, and inflection is more something that's more sensory, it's more concrete, so it begins to fall out as language becomes more and more abstract. And he says that all of this probably took place sometime during the Neolithic, within the 2,000 or 3,000 years preceding the rise of the great high civilizations. So then he says that with the rise of the high civilizations, then we begin to get writing. Writing comes in with the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. Whereas the effect of language, oral speech, language liberates the understanding from sensation and allows the human being to set up a second world, a mental world, a thought world, an abstract world that parallels the sensory world, and in many cases remains concretely tied with it. But as with the idea of the noumena, the name, it also liberates a thought space in which the images don't necessarily, the thought words don't necessarily correspond to what the visual impressions are. But he says what happens with writing is that writing liberates the waking being from the tyranny of the present. Writing is a historical type of medium par excellence. It's always directed toward the future. Unborn generations even may read what you are writing at this very moment. So it represents a will to extension, a will to the far, right there with the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. And he says that notice correspondingly the two high civilizations, the Greeks and the Hindus, who were the least historically minded, the two ahistoric civilizations, are the only two in whom writing came late, very late. Classical civilization begins around 1100 BC. Writing doesn't get there till the time of Homer, 750 BC. Same thing with the Hindus. It begins just about the same time, 1200 BC, and writing doesn't get there either till about 650 BC. And in both cases, it comes late, and the scripts are borrowed from other people. The Greeks borrow the script of the alphabet from the Philistines, and the Hindus borrow the Brahmi script from other people. So it actually comes from other people's. And he says it's also interesting that classical man didn't even regard texts, their papyrus scrolls, as something worth preserving. We don't really have any preserved scrolls and early texts from the Greeks, whereas from the Egyptians we have plenty of texts of early papyri in their original form that have been preserved for thousands of years. Of course, in Egypt we have the dry climate to thank for a lot of that. But nonetheless, the Egyptian civilization is a civilization that is intensely historic and is based upon a will into the future that was entirely lacking in the kind of moment-by-moment life of classical man. Hindu civilization, I would mention, Spengler doesn't talk about this, but Hindu civilization, writing not only came late there, but it actually didn't really take in any effective way, the way it did in Greece, in any really effective way until very, very late, actually. It remained basically something for administrative purposes. The great creative events of India, the creations of the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the creations of the Upanishads and the Brahmanas, even the Rig Veda, none of these things were written down, actually, for the most part, until the British got there. So there was a prodigious feat of memory in Indian civilization. This is the civilization, even though it may have been ahistoric, it trained itself to remember texts in a way that we find astonishing. It's a little bit like Ray Bradbury's ending of Fahrenheit 451, where he has everyone's burning the books, so what each individual has to devote his life to is memorizing line by line a classic. So each individual at the end of the book is busy memorizing a classic. One person will memorize all of Jane Eyre, and that'll be that person's entire life task, is to memorize it and recite it word by word. This is what happens in an oral culture, and this is what the Hindus did. Their pundits and their wandering sannyasis memorized these texts, and then when the British went in there and interviewed them, they were astonished at how similar the texts were when recited by pundits in differing locations. So writing came very, very late, and Indian civilization, it never really even took very well at all, except other than for practical purposes. It wasn't essential to the creative act of Indian civilization, which to us is astonishing. But that is the great feat of that civilization. So he says that writing then represents is something that historical man possesses. It doesn't exist prior to the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians because the civilizations prior to them are not in history. They are in a historyless state. And indeed, if you look at the Neolithic and you study it, it does change. Culture forms do evolve, but over thousands of years, the conservatism is enormous and tremendous. If you look at the entire history of Çatalhöyük that James Mellard outlines in his book, the change there is very minimal. That site is there for something like 7,500 to 6,500 to somewhere over 1,000 years, 1,500 years even, with very, very little change. And what change does come to the site comes as the result of these large fires that destroy the site and diminish the culture, and then it has to be rebuilt, but it's always in a further and further impoverished form each time. So the Neolithic just exists in this sort of timeless, ahistoric mode where centuries and centuries and millennia will go by with very little change in the culture forms, which are largely composed of pottery in the later Neolithic, the pottery Neolithic, the earlier pre-pottery Neolithic. The sculpture is all in stone. And anyhow, civilization writing rather comes in with the advent of high civilization, which Spengler sees as the beginnings of the historic mentality, the mode of mentality that signifies historical metabolism. Once that gets going, it's only natural that writing comes in as the historical means for capturing knowledge, preserving it, liberating the mentality from the tyranny of the present, and setting it going. Now, he says that writing also remains very closely tied in civilizations to the cult, to the religious side of things, to the totem side, not so much the taboo side. The nobility is more on the taboo side, the Dasein side, the side of destiny and factuality and perpetuation of the blood, whereas the totem side is the side of laws and rules and prescriptions. That's the side of the priest. And of course, the nobleman, he says, generally has scorn and disdain for writing. He gets scribes and priests to do his writing for him. He's not interested in it. This was true even all the way back to the Egyptians, where the scribe was essential to every vizier had his scribe, and the scribe was revered in Egypt in a way that he wasn't revered in Mesopotamia to quite the same degree. So he says that it remains very closely tied to the cult, and he says that if you look at, for example, in the Quran, a beautiful Quran that is written in the Kufi script, each page of it is a tapestry in miniature. As you turn each page of this classical text, each one is a tapestry in miniature. As he says that a Gothic illuminated manuscript is basically a cathedral in miniature. So these texts remain very closely tied, and then to the religion, the cult, and then he also says that with regard to the Magian civilization, this is the one civilization, remember, where the political modality is consensus, the consensus community. Each consensus community, each religion, each faith in that civilization invents its own script. Its own form of writing, whether it's Arabic or Hebrew or Pahlavi or Avestan, Farsi. Each one invents its own script, and so it has the most number of scripts. The Magian civilization is the one with the most number of scripts.